Hello everyone, and welcome to the world-renowned review of AMC's The Terror, Season 2, Episode 1, entitled A Sparrow in a Swallow's Nest. I am the world-renowned historian. Hey, The Terror's back, y'all! You know, if you're anything like your neighborhood WRH, you were probably a little bit like, wait, what? Season 2? That don't make no sense. I done seen how the story ends. They finished it more or less when Dan Simmons' book finishes, though they changed things up a little bit. How are they going for another season? But then it came to my attention that they're going kind of American Horror Story with it. Sort of a different story with different characters. Of course, with American Horror Story, it's the same actors, different actors in The Terror. But the idea remains. It's a different story and different characters built around a similar governing theme for the show, which I think is actually really interesting. In the case of American Horror Story, it seems to be like just kind of general creepy, perverse horror and sexual bondage gear. But if we're talking about the governing theme of The Terror, I think it would be taking an actual historical event or an actual historical situation and adding horror to it. And I thought, that's really interesting. That's cool. That could have some legs. That could be pretty good. Not to spoil too much, but it's pretty dang good. So the first season of The Terror took a very specific historical incident following the Dan Simmons novel and, used all these specific real people that were actually involved in that historical incident, that being the Franklin expedition in the 1840s, and kind of added a monster to it. This season is taking a slightly different tack in that it's taking a very specific real historical incident, that being the internment of Japanese Americans following the attack on Pearl Harbor and precipitating America's entrance into World War II, but mostly fictionalizing the characters, which is kind of an interesting take, because these people are all fictional, but they're recreating things that must have happened, and people who, even if these are not the exact people who were there, these kinds of people had to be there, and these relationships had to be there, and these kinds of things must have happened, the things they're going through. In a strange way, that dichotomy between these two first seasons kind of reminds me of the two fathers of history and their dichotomy, those being Thucydides and Herodotus. Herodotus, of course, very famously had the idea that if it didn't happen exactly this way, don't report it. Whereas Thucydides would happily put a speech in somebody's mouth and say, well, that must be the kind of thing they would have said. By the way, that's hilarious in retrospect, given that Herodotus exaggerated wildly, particularly in regard to numbers, but the dichotomy still holds. Thucydides was okay with building models where he'd say, okay, this is exactly what this person would have said and must have said, whereas Herodotus wouldn't do that necessarily. So the first season was kind of more Herodotus, and the second season is going a little more towards Thucydides. And by the way, just before we get going on this season, I do want to add the caveat, I'm mostly going to leave politics out of it as much as I can. I realize that with this material, it's kind of unavoidable, especially given certain, things that are happening today. And you can call me a coward for this if you want. I certainly have my political opinions, but I find it makes my life a lot better to keep my politics and my entertainment separate. And I try to do that in my life as much as possible. So, again, call me a coward for it if you want. Feel free to argue with anybody in the comments. I won't moderate any of that, but I'm not going to make any political statement. I'm going to avoid it as much as I can and just take the show on its merits and on its own terms. So just one quick personal note before we get going, if you all will permit me. I'd probably be remiss if I didn't point out that I was born about a half hour from and lived my first 18 years of my life from the camp where a very prominent member of this cast was kept when he was a child. That being George Takei, who is, of course, most famous for being Sulu in Star Trek and as a activist and internet personality in the modern times. But he is a part of this cast, and he was kept at the Manzanar internment camp very close to Independence, California, which is a half hour south of where I was born and lived until essentially I was an adult. So it never really made an impact on me when I was a kid. I don't know, maybe you can say kids are dicks, but it was always like the boring field trip. It was just kind of like a desert with some and this is going to sound like a real asshole thing to say, but some graves with some Japanese writing on it. But as a kid, that's not that interesting. But it certainly has more impact now that I've seen this show. And I hope that doesn't betray any political allegiances. But yeah, that's my personal connection to this show and this world, I guess. So, without further ado, let's jump into this thing. Crack open a cold one, pour yourself a glass of your finest Jim Beam and Cherry Coke, and start the review. I don't know. I can't think of something a cool guy would say to start the review. Just pretend I said something that a cool guy would say that translates to start the review.
Cut that music! What? Cut the music!
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
So, episode 1 starts on a lady getting ready, essentially. It's a Japanese lady. She's, like, doing her makeup. She does her lip gloss. She's wearing, like, the traditional kimono dress. And she puts 2, like, spikes in her hair to hold her bun back, as we've all seen women do from time to time. And on her way out, she walks past a photograph of herself and what we can presume would be her husband and probably her son. Next, we see her walking on a pier out onto the ocean, and she's just walking, and then, like, kind of like her neck buckles, and she's, like, starting to twitch. And we hear, like, a crunch inside her spine somewhere, and then, like, her ankles kind of buckle, and it's genuinely pretty horrifying. And, like, after her ankles buckle, she actually drops to her knees. And then she pulls one of the hair spikes out of her bun and points it at her ear and stabs herself through the brain. Yeah. This show ain't fucking around. So next up, we have the funeral of who we find out to be Mrs. Furuya. We see her husband, Hideo Furuya, and her son, the other 2 gentlemen who were in the photograph with her that she passed. And then we center in on Chester Nakayama, who ends up being our main character. And he is at the funeral, and he has what turns out to perhaps be a hallucination, as he sees a string on his sleeve, and he pulls on it. And it just keeps coming and coming and coming. And then he kind of realizes with horror that it's inside his own body. And he keeps pulling, and he realizes it's coming out of this gaping wound in his wrist that then disappears. It seems to have been a hallucination. Chester then has a flashback with Mrs. Furuya, and he tells her she doesn't have to do this if she doesn't want to. We don't know what this is yet. And she tells him that she can't tell the future because it's written by too many hands. But she then also tells him to come back in a week to pick up whatever he's ordered, and then all will be okay. Next, we learn that we are in Terminal Island in 1941. Terminal Island is a basically artificial island very close to San Pedro, California, in Southern California. Also close to, like, Hermosa Beach, Long Beach, places like that. Does still exist. In fact, houses a federal penitentiary now, but in fact was the destination for about like 4,000 Japanese Americans who came over. So they definitely did live there. This is at the end of the funeral when we cut back to them. Chester is getting everyone together for a picture, asks Mr. Furuya, Hideo Furuya, to, you know, get in there on the picture for his wife's portrait with her coffin. Furuya-san approaches Chester, and he tells him, "You forgot this," and he hands him 2 vials, and he calls him a coward. Again, we don't know what these vials are for yet. But then also, the wind picks up, and Mrs. Furuya's coffin blows over, and this is genuinely pretty awful as her corpse, like, falls out of it. And Chester and Furuya-san, you know, kind of carry her back in. And then the Yoshidas have a conversation about how they may have been followed from Japan by a spirit. One of them says, "God, after this many years, this many miles, how is that possible?" So Chester's on the family fishing boat with his father and Yamoto-san. Yamoto-san is, of course, George Takei, and he has some fun dialogue about how he was the tuna boxing champion of San Pedro, about how he caught a fish twice his size and punched it in the face or something. It's kind of fun. I'm not mad at it. But Chester and his father, Henry, discuss the possibility of a bakemono at the funeral. And Chester is very skeptical, whereas his father is a little bit more open to the idea. Which completely makes sense, because Chester is American-born, whereas his father, Henry, was born in Japan and immigrated. So he has a little bit more of the old world idea, whereas Chester is strictly kind of Americanized. Though you might be justified in wondering, dear viewer, just what is a bakemono? Well, I'm glad you asked. Bakemono, simply put, essentially just means monster in Japanese culture. The word literally means changing thing, because these creatures are often shapeshifters or the result of some bizarre transformation. A critical thing to keep in mind, though, is that these things are not thought of to be supernatural in Japanese culture. They are considered natural living beings, with the ability to shapeshift. For our purposes, the two most important things to keep in mind about bakemono are this. Number one, they are shapeshifters. Some sort of transformation is involved. Number two, in Japanese culture, they are considered to be natural, not supernatural beings. They are thought of as living creatures. You can distinguish them from other Japanese monsters like the yurei, who were the ghosts of a human, a more purely supernatural figure. So Stan Grichak, the fish buyer, approaches and he essentially insults Henry, Chester's father. They discuss the fish and what the price will be, as Chester is standing up for his father, who is kind of more meek than Chester is. And again, I understand where they're going with this relationship, because it makes sense that Henry, as a first-generation immigrant, would have become a little bit more meek and, deferential, just as a survival mechanism, where Chester never had to do that because he's actually native born, so he's got a little bit more pull than his father does in that way. So essentially Henry is just deferring to this guy while Chester tells him, no, this is not how this is going to go. You're going to give us the full price for these fish. And it's actually kind of interesting when Grichak shows up and he's pulling out the fish. He's like, oh, I've got devilfish mixed in. I've got squid mixed into my mackerel. It is kind of an interesting metaphor for, what a lot of Americans thought about, Japanese people coming over at the time. It's like, oh, well, there's all these good ones, but there could be these spies mixed in or whatever. And then also, it's a metaphor for these Japanese coming over and having a bakemono come over with them. The devilfish is both a metaphor for potential spies and also a bakemono. So Chester and Henry drive Henry's Packard into town, and they run into Chester's best friend Marlin, who is a white naval sailor, who Henry calls Hakujin, which is just a Japanese word for white people. It's not derogatory or anything. It's just essentially just saying Caucasian. But it's another demonstration of that generational difference. And they talk about how they bought tickets to take Walt Yoshida, who is getting married soon, to go see Down Mexico Way, starring Gene Autry, which, fun fact, was, as a matter of fact, also filmed very close to my hometown. If there's my hometown, a half an hour south of it is the Manzanar camp where George Takei was incarcerated when he was a child, and then a half an hour south of that is where they filmed Down Mexico Way. But in any case, Henry sees a propaganda poster behind him, and we see kind of an interesting depiction of the subtleties of racism, where Marlin and Chester are best friends, but Marlin also uses racial slurs that could also apply to Chester. So it's like he doesn't view Chester as part of that group that he's slurring. But Henry asks Marlin to keep him away from danger, being concerned that he will be shot. Alright, y'all, so this is when shit gets pretty real. We find out why Chester was meeting with Mrs. Furuya in that earlier scene where she was mixing herbs for him. So, he has a flashback about laying in bed with a beautiful lady. Her father's right down the hall. Chester kind of gets cold feet, but she's like, yeah, let's go for it. And then we cut to present time, and she appears. Her name is Luce, we hear. And she is notably less friendly towards him. And it's very obvious that he's brought her abortion drugs. Miscarriage drugs, if you will. She speaks Spanish and says that it's an offense against God. Chester thinks that Mrs. Furuya probably killed herself because she gave him the abortion drugs. And Luce is like, you can't hang that on yourself. And he's like, no, she just did it because it was me. But she couldn't take the fact that she'd done it, which leads me to believe there's certain Japanese social cues I'm maybe not necessarily getting with this show, but that's a whole other story. Chester says they're just going to go their separate ways, and she can go to college or nursing school or whatever it is, and he can go travel the country. It's kind of a free wandering spirit, and nothing will get in the way. And Luce shares with him that she was going to become a nun, and she says that she only liked the sound of it, not the thing itself. Which is interesting, because then Chester goes too. He wishes he could have taken her out in his dad's Packard, which is that car we talked about a moment ago. Chester, like, the long and the short of it is Chester has big dreams, and he wants to see the world. Like, he cannot live his life on that island. Something I kind of relate to. Next, we cut to Grichuk and Henry in the, fish cutting room. And Grichuk is essentially trying to bilk Henry again. He's saying that the fish are too small and the girls have to, like, split them by hand. And Henry, in his way, is kind of trying to go along to get along. And he's about to get robbed by this guy when Grichuk gets his necktie caught in the machine. Was this a supernatural event? The Bakemono looking out for Henry Nakayama? I don't know. I guess we'll probably find out. But Henry saves his life. Grichuk doesn't say thank you. He just sort of looks at him and runs off. So Chester is developing his photos from the funeral, and he sees a strange smudge where a person should be. And next up, they're at a dinner. We hear that Betty is sailing back from Tokyo. She still has a semester, but she's leaving while she can. Kind of an interesting, like, war is coming sort of thing. We hear that Chester wants to be a photographer, and he doesn't want to, catch fish all his life. Mrs. Yoshida tells Chester that you can't live without family, and Chester makes a very snide comment about Mrs. Furuya's suicide. After dinner, Chester is on a walk with his good friend Amy. They're outside, walking, having some cigarettes. She lets on that she's been going with a Hakujin naval officer. She says, please don't tell my parents. They'd die or I would die. She reveals that Hideo Furuya, husband of the woman who killed herself in the first scene, would often beat his wife and then forget about it because he was too drunk, and then beat her again when he saw the bruises because he thought she was stepping out on him. And Amy asks Chester if he knows why she would kill herself, and Chester privately thinks that he knows, but he lies and says that he hadn't seen her in a long time. Next, there's a banging on the Nakayama's door. Henry hides away the women and goes to answer the door. It's Grichuk. We find out that he's been laid off, and he essentially extorts Henry. He says, I did all I could for you. After the anti-spy laws were passed, I know that they said you had to register your boats, but I didn't make you do it, and you didn't do it. And Henry says, well, that's because I was out fishing for you. And Grichuk essentially says, don't make me the kind of guy who has to report you. Grichuk essentially steals Henry's Packard car that he was so proud of. And that's actually when he chooses to thank him for saving his life, when his his necktie was caught in the cannery slicer. So Chester sits down with his father, and he tells him that they have to do something about Grichuk coming over to steal his Packard. He tells him literally, be a man. And the actor who plays Henry, Chester's father, he has a wonderful performance in this scene. He tells him, look, my father didn't even have an ox when I was in Japan. Like, Henry says, I had to pull the cart myself. And his one goal when he got to America was to be the guy who earned a car, a cart to pull him, instead of having to pull the cart himself. And he says, I'm still that guy. I'm still the guy who earned that Packard. So don't you tell me how to be a man. It's good writing in that I can see both sides. Chester is like, look, you deserve better than this. And Henry is like, look, this is what has allowed me to survive in this alien environment to the one I grew up in. Hideo Furuya is getting drunk in his house when Mrs. Nakayama comes over and offers him soup for him and his son. And while they're eating, she does rituals around the house to do purification. When he notices what's happening, he gets mad and he's like, we're not being haunted! Get the hell out of my house! So Henry Nakayama goes to the bar, and the bartender, who's a white guy, I don't know if you care that he's a white guy, but he is. He tells, he was consoling Henry, and he tells him that he'll have a Cadillac by next Christmas. And, Henry kind of appreciates the consolation. But he sees Furuya-san there, Hideo Furuya, and he apologizes for his wife's intrusion and bringing the soup over and, doing the salt rituals and whatnot. And Furuya-san is basically just like, hey, at least you got a wife. And he says that he's got to go take a leak, and he goes out to do so, and he passes a well-dressed Japanese lady in kind of traditional garb, and he kind of does like a double take, and like the wind hits him, and he is like struck by something, and he like kind of falls to his knees, and like he stares directly at the sun, and it burns his eyes because you really shouldn't stare directly at the sun. So Chester and his boys are drinking at the bar. Turns out they didn't go see that Gene Autry film. That was just a tall tale, if you will. They do get their story straight about it, though. They talk a little bit about how Furuya-san went blind the same week his wife died, and Chester's getting a little bit less skeptical about the whole supernatural thing. By the way, in the funeral for Mrs. Furuya, when he has like the hallucination about pulling the string out of his arm, and then suddenly it's not there anymore, I don't know. That probably would have been a good sign to me that this was not all, fun and games. But I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit of a problem in the writing. But anyways, they're at a whorehouse. Walt Yoshida is getting married. Chester does not go up with the girls. They all say, oh, he's got a steady girl, referring to Luce. They don't know that he's broken up with Luce. Anyway, all his boys go upstairs. Well, Chester kind of putts around in the drawing room. He picks up a book of chansons, which means songs in French, and he stops briefly on a page bearing the opera Ariane et Bacchus. This is not an accident. Okay, so there's about 100,000 ways we could talk about how this opera relates to this story, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to keep it to two. Number one, this opera relates very much to Ovid's Metamorphosis. If you don't know Ovid, look him up. We're not going to talk that much about him here. But literally the first line of this poem is, I intend to speak of forms changing into new entities. Does that remind you of something? Perhaps the Bakemono shape-shifting spirit. Secondly, it also refers to the story of Ariadne. Now, if you're not familiar with that, Ariadne helped Theseus kill the Minotaur. She gave him a ball of string. I don't know if the string that Chester's pulling out of his arm, I don't know if it refers to that. It might. I'm not sure yet. But she did give him a ball of string to help him get back out after he kills the Minotaur. So, after he does kill the Minotaur, she elopes with Theseus, and Theseus ends up abandoning her. Keep that in mind for Chester's story. So a woman in a kimono sits on the steps kind of above him, and he sets down the book. He takes a picture of her, and she stops what she's doing. She's kind of making tea up there, and she's like, oh, you're Japanese, and oh, Miss Antoinette told me to serve tea to you. It's probably kind of an interesting plot point that she notices that he's Japanese. Keep that in mind for later. She clearly looks like the woman who blinded Furuya earlier. She tells him that her name is Yuko, and he says that his mind is troubled, and she senses that his heart is burdened. He basically tells her that he screwed up with his girlfriend Luce. And she offers to read his tea leaves in her room, which is well decorated with lots and lots of scary kabuki masks. So Yuko does this ritual where she burns her hand to call the spirits who can tell the future for them. That's a direct callback to Mrs. Furuya's comments earlier. Chester drinks his tea and she reads the leaves, and she says that he is two people. He's light and darkness. He's kind of in both, but he's at home in neither. And that's a sort of a interesting depiction of how he's an immigrant, right? Like his father is very much in the old world, though he's lived in the new world, and Chester wants to be a part of the new world, though he's being dragged back by the old world. And Yuko says that he is a sparrow in a swallow's nest. In the moment that you think you're safe, the swallows are going to peck you to death. That's the title of the episode, of course. She laments the loss of this perfect world that they've lost. And Chester says that he has never known that world, and she asks him what it looks like. And he kind of imagines it. And he says it's, this open plain. That, we have an acre to ourselves. It's this house of wood. And I have a child. Yuko says the child can still be his. And he needs to go restore that path, or he will hunger for it forever. So Chester goes to Grichuk's house and essentially steals his father's car back. Grichuk notices as he's leaving, but Chester goes to Luce's house, and he learns from her that she has not yet taken the miscarriage medication. He has the car, and he essentially says they should elope. Theseus, if you will, is trying not to abandon Ariadne. But she gets realistic on him, and is just like, what do you know about me? You know, all you know about me is that you got me pregnant one night. And, you know, he's all like romantic and wants to run away, and she tells him no. He says, okay, I guess you're right, though he's very obviously, clearly heartbroken. He asks if she's going to take the abortion miscarriage medication, and she says she does not know. So Grichuk is at the cannery plant that he's been laid off from. He picks up a crowbar, a can of fish rolls towards him on the machine that almost killed him, and, you know, he kind of looks back at it. But then he goes out to the Nakayama's boat, and he pours kerosene all over it, and before he can burn it, he lights up a match, but before he can drop those matches, the wind picks up and blows them out. Then the wind kind of blows his hat off, and then something attacks him. So the next day, Chester arrives at the boat, and they almost immediately find Grichuk's body in a fishing net. Henry ascribes this to a demon, while Chester is more inclined to ascribe it to natural causes. In any case, they take the body down, and they're talking to the authorities, and Chester is confident that his friend Marlon will get them favorable treatment. But they have a little conversation about Henry thinks there may be a spirit, you know, at play here who's like attacking their enemies. And it eventually comes out that Henry knows about Chester's pregnancy with Luce. And Chester finally comes clean about knocking her up, frankly. And they argue about how Henry is kind of a pushover and how Chester refuses that lifestyle. And again, it kind of makes sense given their different life experiences. In that moment, as father and son are having a battle, the camera pans around and we see the calendar and we see that it is December 7th, 1941. And the air raid sirens start to, you know, sound out. And Marlon tells them to get the hell out of there. Do any of y'all not know what happened on December 7th, 1941? Okay, so this is maybe something worth spending 2 minutes on. It could be phenomenally complicated. We could go for 100 pages, 1,000 pages, 1,000,000 pages. There have probably been 10 million pages written about this topic in history. But we are just going to give you the highlights of the highlights of the highlights of the highlights. Alright, so a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, but in a planet very, very similar to this one, a people quite like the Europeans and the Americans realized it'd be kind of cool if we could just go out and attack other people and take their stuff. And, or even if it's not quite that easy, we can set up, you know, uneven trade deals that eventually ended up with, the long and the short of it was, we took their stuff. So much so that you could have sayings like, the sun never sets on the British Empire. You could have things like United States Senator Albert J. Beveridge arguing that, quote-unquote, the Philippines is ours in perpetuity. For some reason. That's a thing. That happened. Anyways, the Japanese looked around at all these other powers kind of benefiting from taking the stuff of all these weaker people, and they were like, hey, we want to get us some of that, especially in our local market. So the Japanese started getting them some of that in their local market, especially against British and Dutch and French holdings, kind of locally close to them. And the West response was, no. Cease, and desist. No. These negotiations were incredibly complex, and I leave it to you to do your own research if you want to, and find out who was being more unreasonable. But they were demanding things from either side, and it's crazy to me that people say that Pearl Harbor was a quote-unquote surprise attack. Because, yeah, it was a surprise attack, but it was very clear that these two nations had, like, enmity going back for, like, 20 years at this point. Eventually, between the United States and Japan, things broke down over China. The United States wanted Japan to get completely out of China, and Japan saw this as a completely untenable position. So, they approved the surprise attack. So, I realize we didn't even say it yet, but In the preceding 20 years, obviously there was some hostility between the two countries for some incidents that we're not going to talk about because it's going to overcomplicate things. But shortly before the surprise attack on December 7, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt moves the Pacific Fleet of the United States from San Diego to Hawaii. Not aggressive at all. Again, you could see it as aggressive or not aggressive. You could see it as responding to aggression. It all just depends on your perspective. But you can say on December 8th, 1941, Japan was probably feeling pretty good. You know, they went up 3 touchdowns in the first quarter. Their preemptive strike was very successful. They strategically did what they came to do, even though among them somebody said, "I fear I've awoken a sleeping giant," supposedly. In any event, that's what happened on December 7th, 1941. It's an event that we still mark here in the United States, and I don't know, honestly, if that's an American thing or if that's a thing that happens in every country, but big attacks, be it December 7th, 9/11, we become obsessed with them. And we certainly still, talk about it today. So that's what happened. So Chester is developing photographs as we hear the radio announcer describe what is happening on December 7th, 1941, i.e. the attack on Pearl Harbor. He develops the photo of Yuko that he took at the whorehouse, and her head is blurred out. Just like before. And then there's a banging on the door, and they go outside to find the FBI rounding them up. Henry, in his his characters go along to get along sort of attitude, tells them, "Don't worry, it's fine. It'll all be okay." And they don't take Chester because he was born there. And there's a wonderful zoom out on the entire community of Terminal Island as they're all being taken as the FBI trucks move through them. And the last thing we see in the episode is Yuko lighting a candle. She cracks her neck, which is a kind of a callback to Mrs. Furuya's suicide, where her bones were kind of popping and whistling. And Yuko's skin starts to come away from her face. And she bends a needle to stitch her face back together. And it's interesting to see this demon have, like, mortal flesh concerns. Look, bottom line, this was a great episode of television for what I'm coming to consider to be American Horror Story for adults. And I realize I didn't even mention this yet, but of course, it probably goes without saying for these AMC prestige dramas, the acting, the set design, the costume design, the sound design, everything top-notch. It basically feels like a movie. And I could not be more excited to see the rest of the season and how it unfolds. And just this idea of history meeting horror in incredibly high production values, I feel like probably has some legs. If they continue to, take it to a different, interesting, perhaps maybe even underrepresented in history locale as they did here. Like, I've never seen any story set during the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II, let alone any, like, supernatural horror story. So that's pretty cool. Anything I've never seen, I'm always super excited to see. I'll be honest, it's not really grabbing me like Season 1 did, but then again, Season 1 was based on probably like a top 5 book all time for me, so that's not really a fair comparison. This was a great start to the season, and I cannot be more excited to see where it goes from here. So, till next time, it's your boy, the world-renowned historian. Thank you for watching. If you did so, do all the good YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe. Be good, kiddos. I'm out. Hey y'all, thanks for getting to the end of this episode. So I learned literally in the middle of recording this episode that none other than Al Capone was incarcerated at the Terminal Island Federal Prison. Crazy, right? His baby picture right there, just to freak you out a little bit more. But anyways, if you did get to the end of this episode, thank you for doing so, you glutton for punishment. If you want a little more punishment, if you're that kind of person, right there is another video of mine. And if you want to subscribe, boom. Right down there, that little picture of my logo. It's probably going to be shaped like this. Please hit that button. In my empty, lonely life, the dreams of YouTube e-celebrity is all I have. Anyway, see y'all next time. Be good.